Welcome to the very first event in the Cultureword National Black Writers Conference, and this is called No More Ivory Towers. And just to introduce myself, my name is Cheryl Martin. I'm a co-artistic director of Commonword, which has been going for over 40 years, serving working class, Black, Brown, and other diverse writers, and white working class writers as well. And so I hope we have a little smattering of everybody with us today. I am a Black woman of sort of medium brown complexion. Right now I have a sort of short afro of curls. I'm a bit stocky. I'm wearing multicolored dangly earrings. I have on a bright blue sort of round neck top. And in the background, you can see a little bit of a picture done by a young Ghanaian artist, some flowers in a vase, and my teal colored sofa with cushions on it. And this morning, we are so lucky to have with us Dr. Yvonne Battle-Felton and Shkembi, who is joining us from Australia. And just to tell you a little bit about who they are, Dr. Yvonne Battle-Felton, author of Remembered, is an author, academic, host, and creative producer. Remembered was long listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019 and shortlisted for the Jalop Prize in 2020. Winner of a Northern Writers Award in Fiction in 2017, Yvonne was awarded a Society of Authors Foundation grant for Remembered in 2018. She was commended for children's writing in the Faber Andlin BAME or FAB Prize 2017 and has titles in Penguin Random House's The Ladybird Tales of Superheroes and The Ladybird Tales of Crowns and Thrones. Yvonne has a PhD in creative writing from Lancaster University and is a 2019 British Library Eccles Center visiting fellow and principal lecturer, business and enterprise lead at Sheffield Hallam University, where she lectures in creative writing. Yvonne is also host of Bookable Space, African American Literary Salon, and Bookable Space Middle Grade Book Club. I mean, could she do any more? We are so lucky to have her with us today. And Shkembi is a Melbourne NAARM based independent curator, writer, and emerging scholar. Noor has produced and curated over 150 events, exhibitions, and community engagement projects, and was part of the core team that established the Islamic Museum of Australia, serving as the museum's inaugural art director and exhibitions manager and founding curator. Recent exhibitions include Waqt al-Taghir. I do apologize to everyone everywhere for my appalling, probably pronunciations. Ace Open, Kalas, UNSW Galleries, that's, I guess, New South Wales, the Inner Apartment, Nishi Gallery and National Museum of Australia, Soul Fury, Bendigo Art Gallery, an upcoming Destiny Disrupted, Granville Arts Centre, Sydney. She is currently a fellow of the Centre of Visual Arts and is undertaking a PhD in the Department of Art History at the University of Melbourne. Noor is an academic teacher and guest lecturer for the Masters of Art Curatorship at University of Melbourne and lecturer, Masters of Gallery and Museum Management course at RMIT University. So welcome both of you, incredibly accomplished women. And I'll now, just to say for people, if you don't already know it, the conference theme this year is We Want to Dream. Obviously riffing off Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, but We Want to Dream is about being free to create whatever we want to create without bowing to other people's preconceptions or ticking anybody's boxes. So, you know, welcome to everyone. And I'm just gonna, and if you want to say hi in the chat and, you know, just say, you know, where you're joining us from, that would be great. And just to remind everybody, we are recording us, only the panelists for future posterity, which will eventually be on the Commonword website. But just to turn over now to Dr. Yvonne Battle-Felton.
Good morning. Thank you for that warm introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us now and for watching later. And so to describe myself, it's one of those things that I don't spend a lot of time doing. So I'm going to give it a try. I have beautiful brown skin that makes me smile every time I see it. I have on red lipstick. It's the only makeup that I tend to wear. And it is because I love the shade of it and it brightens my day. And so I do that for other people who also like red lipstick. Let's see. I'm wearing all black, but all you can see is the top, not even half of me. I'm in a black leather chair, which you also can't see. And behind me, I have a blanket of my UK book cover of Remembered. And it's it's so when I move and people like, if you're wondering what that change in background is, it might be that you can now see my blanket. I'm in a room with white walls and with you can see, yeah, it's the tan closet behind me. So it's a really minimal background, and that's the best that I have at physical description. Now, I guess a little bit about me and why I'm here. So I thought it would be a nice exercise for me to kind of remember back about what it was I wanted to be when I was a kid and kind of how close I am to that now. And as a kid, I have to say I always wanted to write. I was one of those kids who I loved telling stories, and I always had a story in my mind and in my heart. Part of that was to entertain other people. And I'd like to say I was always that generous with the stories, but actually a lot of it was about creating stories that I wanted to hear because they amused me or they touched me in some way. And I was the worst person at telling jokes, and that's because they were to amuse me. So I would be halfway through, get to the punchline, and already start laughing because I knew where it was going to go. So maybe on one hand, I was a bit of a performer, so that part of it was for other people, but actually it was for me. It gave me what I needed. So stories created for me a sense of belonging. They made me happy. So it was able to inspire and change my mood. It gave me hope. It gave me joy. When I could share that with other people, it was definitely a bonus. But I also loved school. It wasn't actually, I was one of those kids who I loved playing school, but I didn't want to be the teacher. I loved being the student. I don't know if it was because my sister and my older cousin would be the teacher. And so they would set work that they thought I couldn't do. And I mean, of course I could do it. Um, I don't know if that was because I'd like to think it was because I was super smart, but I think also it was because the nature of the homework they were going to set meant that there were only certain answers that it could be. But they used to tease me when I was a kid because they were old enough to go to school and I wasn't. And so they would come home and they would say, today we learned about this and we did that and they made it sound so magical. And I wanted that magic for myself. It was the one thing that they had that I didn't. So I would be home, playing school, which wasn't the same thing. And other kids, believe it or not, didn't always want to play it. And I think my love for that, I actually do credit my love for learning to my sister and my cousin for making it so competitive. And it turns out I'm a competitive person. When we went that next year for them to go to school, and I was planning to go to school myself, um, it turns out there were rules about when you could go to school, and sometimes that was around how old you were. And in Philadelphia, where I was born, it was, like everywhere else, you had to be a certain age to get into the school. And I wasn't that age yet, but my mom hadn't told me that part about like, you have to be a certain age or there's certain things you have to do. So really, I guess on one hand, if I don't know limits and I don't know boundaries, on one hand, I have my mom to thank for that. Because while she knew I wasn't going to school and she knew it wasn't, you had to be a certain age and she knew it wasn't going to happen, She didn't tell me that. So I didn't know boundaries. I was like 4 years old and the sky was the limit. So I walked into that building with my sister and my cousin, and everybody was finding out which class they were going into. And I don't remember much about being a kid, but I do remember this. And it was that feeling of everyone else leaving and wondering when they were going to get to my name. So my last name was Battle. And so if they were doing it by alphabetical order, I should have been pretty, high in the list. When they were doing it by age, they should have been pretty, I was 4, so I should have been one of the first kids away. And yet I was still in that room with my mom. My sister had gone off, my cousin had gone off, and sooner or later, I was the only one left. I mean, I'm sure there were siblings and, cousins running around, but I mean, I have to say I was a bit selfish. I didn't care about them. When I talked to my mom and I was saying, so, what's going on? And she's like, oh, we're going home now. You don't get to go to school this year. And I did what I think was probably the response I would have today. I cried. I cried and I cried because it felt like this was such an injustice, and it was the worst thing that I could have imagined of happening. And I didn't know how to process it, how to rationalize it, because it made no sense that someone who wanted to be there so much couldn't be there. And I was just inconsolable. And someone from the school came over and they said, okay, if you take this test and if you pass this test, then we'll let you in. To me, that sounded completely fair. I was a test taker. And so I took the test and I passed it, and I got to start school at 4. I don't know if that was the best, outcome, but I do know I loved it. And I don't know if it was because it was that challenge of getting in there, but I appreciated being in there. And I did school like it was a job. Absolutely loved it. And then at some point, I was in high school, and I knew I was going to be a writer because I loved reading and because I needed books and stories in my life. And then before high school, at some point, as much as I wanted to write and be a storyteller, I wanted to be a French fry. I make no excuse for that now. I loved French fries, and I thought, you know what? I always want to be something I love. I think there was something poignant in that I didn't recognize then. And every once in a while, I remember it. And it brings me joy because I'm so far in one hand from that French fry wanting to be child. But actually, I'm not that far from it because I'm still the sort of person who creates opportunities and experiences that I want to have. So maybe in some part, I'm still that child. I still have that inner child. So in high school, there I was first wanting to be a writer, and I was in these courses that were called college bound, which meant that your path was pretty clear. You were going to finish high school and you were going to go to university. And I knew that was what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to do there though. And I don't know if that's because I didn't have this idea that I needed to go to university to write, or because I don't know why, but at some point when it was clear that, okay, you're going to university, then it started becoming less clear what I was going to do. And then I was like, I'm going to be a psychologist because I thought I liked helping people. And I thought it was going to be, well, one, it was a lucrative income too. So I'm sure that was part of the reason. And then also, and I almost hate to admit it, but in my head, I was going to be a psychiatrist and I was going to marry a mortician. And I thought in this way, I mean, you can't win everything, right? And so if I'm trying to save someone and I miss the mark at that time, and then my mortician husband can come and kind of, it was a family business, the healing of people. And then my mom decided that she was going to move to Germany. And we were living in Maryland. And I'm sorry, we were living in New Jersey at the time. And she decided that she was going to move to Germany. And because she needed to find herself. So she needed to move by herself. I can't say I understood that at that time. I can say that my whole world seemed to be changing, and it didn't seem fair and it didn't seem just. And I probably wanted to cry and cry and cry, but I wasn't talking to her. And I was going through this time when I thought emotions were a gift. There's something that they don't come easily to me. I know there are some people who are very good at feeling and processing and expressing emotions. And for some reason, I always feel like I'm emotionally delayed. There's the thing I'm supposed to feel, and then there's actually what I do feel, which is sometimes like nothing right then. And then there's a thing I feel afterwards. So when she said that she was leaving, I know that the one thing I did feel right then was I felt angry and I felt betrayed, but I didn't really recognize it at that time. But I also felt really lost. And if I was looking at the future that I thought I was creating, it had taken a really different turn, something I wasn't expecting. So it took me a long time to kind of get back on track. But one of the first things I did so she did move to Germany, and it meant me kind of reframing what was possible, what would I do next? And I got accepted into a university in Massachusetts for young people who were bright, and I got a scholarship. I wasn't able to appreciate like all the work that I did to get into that, and also all the work that my guidance counselor did to find this program, to convince me at that time to join it. And I was so fortunate. She was one of those people who was, you could do anything. Like, why would you let this stop you? This wasn't even in your plan. So why would that, be the thing that this word block? And that, I mean, I needed that. I needed that person in my life, even if I didn't understand it then the way that I can now. But one thing I did get when my mom left, and I went to university, but I was only there for a semester when I learned that my full scholarship didn't cover my full university experience. And so there was no room and board and no, it was room and board that was cut out of like all those expenses. And there was nobody in my life who was willing to pay that at that time or understood how academia worked or how student loans worked and how that whole process went. And so for my family who hadn't gone to university yet, it became an impossibility. And so because they didn't understand it in the way that maybe we might understand it now, or the way that I certainly understand it now, I wasn't able to continue. So I went back to New Jersey, and I was living with my grandmother, and I was getting more and more lost. And that's an uncomfortable feeling for me, not knowing what I want. Because if I don't know what I want, I can't get it. So I was lost, but I took this class at a community college in Atlantic City, which was in a way kind of funny because I had never wanted to go to school in Atlantic City. No, nothing against it, but I just felt like it wasn't as good as my school that I had gone to. So then while I was there, I took a class, and it was a class about African-American writers. And I have to say, this class, maybe not at that time, but over time, was the most important class I have ever in my life taken. And it was because I started reading Toni Morrison, and Zora Neale Hurston, and Alice Walker, and Maya Angelou. And in these books, in these stories, there were characters who were doing things that I didn't like to the people that they loved. And it kind of helped me to understand that sometimes people you love will do things that you don't like. And I needed to see that because I was experiencing it, but I needed to see it to know that one, my experience, though unique to me, may not be as unique to other people, but also that I wasn't the only one experiencing something like that. And also it kind of gave me a way to process it, to look at, okay, this is how this makes sense to this person. And this is how this is the only course to this person. So when my mom left, like she wasn't leaving me. She was leaving because she felt like she had no other choice. She felt like she was, her words were that she would have gone insane if she stayed. And it was because she was working in the casino. So the casinos, when they came to Atlantic City, they brought jobs and opportunities that people didn't have in that area before. People had jobs, but it was a different sort of job. And it was paying, the jobs previously paid less than the casinos. So they came in wanting to attract new talent. They trained that talent because who knew how to, deal blackjack and do all those different things that were really specific to that experience. So they trained you for this experience, which on one hand meant that's what you could do, but there were so many other things you may not have felt that you could do in other areas. So you were really trained for a specific sort of job. And my mother did well in that specific sort of job. She started with blackjack. And I know because she would, like, to learn it, she would teach my sister and I. So I can play a mean hand of blackjack to this day. But where else is that useful? So she learned how to do that. She was a dealer, and then she became a floor person, and then she became a pit boss, and she was moving up and moving up and moving up, and then she reached the point where she couldn't go any higher. And if she were to try to go higher, it meant either leaving that casino where she'd been for years or staying and waiting for someone to die. Now, I would imagine that does a lot to your psychological well-being, going into work and hoping that someone's not there the next day. So if you feel like there's nowhere to go, I mean, I guess at some point you do kind of break out. I can understand that now. But when I was 16, I didn't understand it. And then to be honest with myself and to be forgiving of my 16-year-old self, I didn't understand it then. And my mother didn't understand it then. All she knew was that she had to leave. So even with the books and the Black women writers kind of guiding my way and just showing me home and definitions and family and all these things I needed in my life, like 100% needed in my life, I was still lost for a while. I moved to Maryland because of the books I was reading. I was inspired to move to Baltimore. And I convinced a friend of mine, although to this day, I'm not sure if I told her it was because I was reading books that told me that Baltimore was the place for me to go and find like my path. If she asked me today, I would tell her. But still, we moved to Baltimore and, life happened. And at some point, I got married, had a family, was working, and I was doing all these things. And I was so far from going back to school that I forgot the dreams that I had. And it wasn't until the breakdown of my marriage that I realized I had lost parts of myself. So I became all the different roles I was doing, which was great. I mean, I was great at momming. I was great at working. If I was to say, what do I like to do at that time, I would not have had a clue. But I didn't even know I didn't have a clue. But I had started years later when my children, I had 2 at the time, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to take this bed and breakfast class because for some reason I'd always wanted to own a bed and breakfast. And I say for some reason, but I think it's because the woman in my life that wasn't in the book, the one person off the page who inspired me to be my very best all the time was my grandmother. And she was one of those people who just filled a room, a space, a house with love. My grandmother had 4 children. So to her, she did the math. 4 children meant she should buy 4 houses. So she had 4 houses, one for each child. The first one was her father had made this house. So she got it, rebuilt and restructured. And that was going to be for one of her kids. But until that time, she was renting it out. And so that house had a job. It was making money. And then she had another one in Philadelphia that she had lived in at one point, but moved to New Jersey. So the one in Philadelphia, until her kids were ready, it was earning money. It was a guest house. It was rented out. And then she had one in New Jersey. That was this huge, massive pink and white house. It was probably the only pink and white house I've seen in like a really long time, but it was absolutely beautiful. And beautiful as it was, it had a house, it had a job. So this house was a guest house. It took in an older woman who needed to be cared for and whose family was no longer around to care for her. She lived in the cellar apartment. It had in the upstairs, it was people could come for like weekends and visit. So that was the guest house part. And then the floor above it was for people to stay longer term. So that house had a job. And her 4th house, which was around the corner from that house, was more, people could rent it more longer term. So each of her houses had a job. And so she had 4 houses. She also was working as in Monmouth, New Jersey. So she worked for the government, lived in Atlantic City with her family on the weekends, and lived in Monmouth 5 days a week to work. I've always known about hustling. It's something that you do when you want to create opportunities, you want to create dreams, you want to live the life you want to live. And my grandmother was one of those people she was a planner. So she was always taking care of other people, always taking care of herself, and always making things possible. So I feel like I come from a long line of people who create opportunities when there seems to be no other way. So for me to be lost, I think at some point it was kind of like, you need to find yourself. Like nobody's going to do this for you, and nobody can do that for you. So I started with this bed and breakfast class. And during it, I realized like, no, I don't really want a bed and breakfast, not while my kids were little, but maybe, in the future. But one thing that class gave me was when I left, I think I was one of those moms who felt like the world does not turn if I'm not there to help it spin. And when I came back, all of my children were there. My now ex-husband had fed them and helped with homework, and like there were no fires for me to put out. They could do it if I was doing what I wanted to do too. They could survive even if I was happy doing something else. So I started going back to school, and I went part-time, and I loved it, loved every single minute of it. Then I felt like if I could do that and I could work and I could mom, I can go back to school more. So I did that, and I took more and more classes, finished there, transferred to get my bachelor's, did that like it was a job, and I was doing it and doing it and doing it. And I was doing it in such a way that I didn't experience the campus experience. I didn't know anybody else who was in the classroom, but I was doing my classes and I was getting that done. And slowly but surely, I was finding more and more about myself. I was loving that feeling of being in a classroom again. I was loving that feeling of creating something, an experience that I wanted to have, and giving myself that, because I'd lost that. I lost that ability to look at what it is that I want and to go after it. There's something about like getting what I want that brings me joy. There's no other way to say it. It brings me joy. So after I got my master's degree, I was offered a job teaching part-time. Now, remember, I said I had never wanted to be a teacher. So it was kind of like, wow, do I want to do it now? And to be honest, the reasons I started teaching were because I loved momming, and I loved providing for my kids, and teaching part-time meant that I could teach around when I was momming. So I could still drop my kids off, I could still pick them up, and in between it, I would be doing work. And to me, that felt like a really, well-balanced, good sort of day. And that probably lasted maybe 1 year. And after that, it was because I was teaching part-time like it was a full-time job. So I started teaching at the one place that I did my, it would have been called an associate's degree, but I left before I did that so I could do the bachelor's degree. But I started teaching there. Then I started teaching at the place I did my bachelor's. And then I started teaching at in another county because it was just nearby. And I was doing so much of that my schedule was just getting lost within it. And what I wanted was getting lost within it. But I was providing for my family. And then I thought, you know what, I want a full-time faculty position, not because I wanted to teach full-time, but because I wanted control of my schedule. And then someone was doing a PhD at Lancaster, and they told me about this experience. And all the jobs I was looking at said you had to have a PhD. So I needed to be Dr. Yvonne Battle-Felton. So I found a program that she recommended. I did that. And while I was in Lancaster, I moved my family from the US to the UK so I could pursue this degree, so I could pursue me. Because one gift I got from my master's program was a class that I took that inspired me to look at my life like I was a character in my own story. And that meant I had to be the central character of my own story. It also meant I had to recognize what my motivation was. And it brought me back home. And I recognized that I have obstacles and that I can overcome them. And so when I get lost, I look at my life like a story, and it helps me to plot it, to chart it, to find my way back to that center. At Lancaster, I did Lancaster like it was, I had so much fun. I had a ball. And part of that was because while I was there, I was finding myself. I was researching, I was writing, I was teaching, I was momming, but I was seeking and I was finding. I was creating experiences because I needed these experiences. When I am at an event, I like feeling welcomed. I like feeling that I've been seen and listened to, appreciated. And I was creating experiences with a friend that created that feeling that I wanted to get, that I needed to get. So I needed to be a part of that. And one thing I've learned is I have no patience. Now, honestly, that's why I am not a psychiatrist today, because it's a slow process and you can hurt somebody if you do it wrong. Because I know I don't have patience, I really am not the person for someone to come and say, I've had this problem, and 5 years later to still have that problem and me not go, come on, let's move on. So because I didn't want to break anybody, I knew I couldn't do that. I knew I needed to be writing again, because writing soothes my soul and it makes other things possible. And if it helps me to chart where I want to be, and if books and stories have connected with me, and like in times when I needed humanity and I needed empathy and I needed to feel, books provide that for me. And I write because I want to do that for other people, and because doing it does that for me. And at Lancaster, being able to create those experiences that I want to have, it's a joy like no other. And it inspires me now. So I've completed my PhD. I'm teaching at Sheffield Hallam University. Part of what I do is about creating opportunities for colleagues and for students, for businesses and the community, but it's also creating experiences that I want to have. So imagine being in a job, in a role that lets you or inspires you or challenges you to create experiences that you want to have. That's how I use my academic privilege, my academic experience. I'm a storyteller. I love stories. I love bringing people together over stories. And if I can have a job, a role that makes that part of my responsibility, because that's what I want, then I'm 100% going to keep doing those sort of things that allow me to create spaces where I can be, where my children can feel safe and feel seen and feel represented, and where I can represent other people and create spaces for them where they feel that they belong. I'm sorry, I've gone on for quite a while, so I'm going to mute myself.
I don't think anybody else wants you to mute yourself, Yvonne. If you check out the chat, it's full of how inspiring your story has been. And I'm going to come back to the aspects of it that are inspiring, but I think that note that you want to create experiences for others that you want to have, and that's what you're using your role in academia to do. And the fact that writing soothes your soul. I want people to hold on to those two thoughts as we move on now to Noor. So Noor, if you'd like to have your say now.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Yvonne. That was like, I was completely immersed. I wanted you to keep going. I want to hear the end of the story. I know we're in the middle of it and you're still, you know, creating your story. But yeah, I just feel like I want to hear more, like it's so inspiring. So just to let everybody know, I am tuning in from Melbourne. The Indigenous name for Melbourne is Naarm. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I live and work, so the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So this is an acknowledgement we do here in Australia to acknowledge that we are living on occupied Indigenous land, and that there is no treaty, and sovereignty has not been ceded, essentially. So thank you for, this invitation, Cheryl. And, I'd like to sort of pick up on some of the ideas that Yvonne was sharing, or like inspirations, I should say. They're not even ideas, they're inspirations. And, I feel like there's some synergy there, and I can really relate to this idea of, like creating things or opportunities for myself that weren't there, that I couldn't see. And, and I'm also, sorry, I forgot to describe myself. I just realized then I was about to talk about curating, because, I'm not very good at describing myself, even though I'm a curator and my job is to describe visual content. So excuse me, pardon, and I'm very sorry to anyone who's listening, and I will describe myself now. So I am a Muslim woman with white skin. I'm wearing a charcoal grey veil. I have brown eyes, and I'm wearing a kind of grey jumper. Behind me, I have some incredible artwork, a photograph by a Bengali female artist, Tahia Farian Haq. There's a couple of illustrations by Safdar Ahmed from his graphic novel Still Alive, which speaks to the refugee experience and the detention of refugees here in Australia. And there's a red brick, clinker brick fireplace behind me and a white wall. So sorry about that. So yeah, just Yvonne, that was incredible, and I love the way you have really thought deeply about or reflected upon your childhood, and really got into the core of your own inspiration and of what drives you. And I feel like that if we all took the time to think about that in the way that you've just generously shared with us, we would have a better understanding of what drives us, definitely. And for myself, I was born and raised in Christchurch in New Zealand, and my family were migrants to New Zealand. My father escaped from Albania on political asylum. My mother was displaced from her home and her family had to migrate to Istanbul in Turkey. And then my parents sort of met and married and had us in New Zealand, and there were very few migrants at that time. And I remember sort of growing up and my mother having ornaments and objects and things, let's be cliche here, like genie bottles and these incredible copper artworks and objects that she had brought with her from Turkey that her family had given her not to forget where she had come from. And so I spent a lot of time as a child looking at these objects, these beautifully intricately made Islamic objects, and that I didn't see this anywhere else. So the things that were inside my home, my family home, even sort of relatives going back, my mum would go back overseas and come back and her suitcase would be full of lemon colonia and Turkish delight and Turkish coffee and all these sort of things that you couldn't get at the time in the 70s in New Zealand. And kind of realizing that nobody else had a house like our house, inside. And I couldn't see any of my culture, any of my heritage anywhere, not in the education we had at school, not in the museums, not in the galleries, not anywhere. So you grow up kind of with this strangeness that a part of you is hidden, I guess. It's you don't see it outside anywhere. And then we moved to Australia, and again, sort of growing up and sort of entering the arts, I never saw anything that resembled or spoke to diversity, or this idea of migration, or heritage that was outside of the Anglosphere. And there was this constant kind of feeling of something is not right, it's not complete. So I started seeking out artists, I started seeking out art, and I put together the first nationwide exhibition of contemporary Muslim artists, and that ran annually for 5 years. And I did that because I wanted to find people like me, and I wanted to see what they were making, because I couldn't see it anywhere else. I wanted to hear their stories, and literature and writing, visual art, especially the work of contemporary artists, is so full of personal narratives. It's so full of history. And, you know, it's another way of documenting history. Artists are brilliant at, you know, documenting what's going on around them, and through a really raw lens, like, you know, through exactly how they see the world. And, you know, I was really hungry for that. And, you know, so when you kind of see things, you know, like on a bio, like I was you know, one of the founding team members, you know, to build the Islamic Museum of Australia, it's one line in a CV, but that was 10 years in the making, you know. That was a commitment. Like, I went out and I found the artists. I made it a thing that there was such a thing as, like, you know, Islamic art in Australia. So I went and I sought that, and like you, kind of, you know, I couldn't find it and I couldn't see it, so I made it. I made what I wanted to see. And, you know, likewise, you know, I wanted to formalize what I was doing in academia, because I couldn't find a record of this anywhere. So if you look at, you know, the art history canon in general, and particularly in Australia, it has a very white centre. And, you know, there's a lot of work happening now to shift that. There's an acknowledgement that, in particular, you know, with First Nations, Indigenous Australians, you know, it's almost like the history of their visual culture, material culture, was running alongside what was deemed as, you know, the centre of, you know, art history. So, you know, there's steps towards kind of unpicking and decentering the Australian art history canon. And, you know, part of that involves also looking at narratives that have been traditionally marginalised, that haven't been written in, that have been ignored, not counted as significant enough. So that's what my current work is now. And I'm working with a group of scholars, and we are looking at this idea of, well, they recently changed the project from decentering to recentering, because it's about, like, not making the white Anglo majority the centre. It's about the history of art in Australia, how it, you know, like how it's flowed, and how it's, you know, come together over the decades, and not through one single lens. So, you know, that's a really big sort of task in itself. And my particular field of inquiry is contemporary Islamic art, and looking at that in Australia. But again, for me, even finding a supervisor that could supervise my project, there's nobody with the expertise that I need. There is no department of Islamic art in Australian museums or galleries. They have collections, and they are subsumed into the Asian art department. Like, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here in particular. And, you know, part of my drive is similar to what you were talking about, like, you know, making your own way, like forging your own pathway, and, you know, creating narratives that make sense to you, and it's the world the way you see it, and that is valid, right? And, you know, it comes, for me, really feeling that, you know, it's like hearing you speak is so nourishing. Like, it's so important that you are doing what you're doing, and that you are sharing that with us in the way that you're sharing it. You know, because otherwise it's kind of just an abstract feeling or thought, you know, that this may or may not be a possibility. But hearing other people doing it, you know, because I'm in the midst of it, I need to know that I can do it. You know, I often say, I joke with my supervisor and say, I'm probably going to fail my PhD, because there is such a fixated idea about what Islamic art is from the Western art history canon, that what I'm doing is so radical that I could have like somebody examining my you know, PhD saying, well, you know, no, you know what I mean? So there's always kind of that doubt sort of, you know, like, am I, you know, forging ahead in a way that's just going, I'm going to shoot myself in my own, you know, in the foot, you know. But, you know, hearing you, it helps me kind of set those doubts aside. And, you know, in saying that, for anybody who is looking at, I guess, forging their own way, creating narratives that are traditionally deemed as like alternative narratives, or they're sidelined, or it's not real like academia, or it's not, you know, a real way of, you know, it's not a bona fide way of doing things. Like, seek out your cohort, seek out other people that are kind of doing what you're doing, and that will help you. And speaking of which, I do want to kind of, and I'm terribly sorry to everybody who has zero interest in art history, but I'm going to read a quote from an article written by an independent art historian and curator by the name of Maimana Farhat. And this quote, or coming across this writing, kind of cemented, you know, so many things for me. It kind of like what you were talking about earlier, Yvonne, like coming across the Black writers that validated or articulated feelings. They articulated ideas and feelings that you were having, and it was kind of your aha moment. So for me, coming across a scholar in art history, and there are a few of them around, but not enough of them, that kind of encapsulated my rage and articulated what I was feeling, was just like an aha moment for me. So, you know, so I'll start with this quote. So this fascination with Islamic art continued into the 16th and 17th centuries, as European painters often incorporated artisan crafts into figurative compositions. Hans Holbein the Younger, a German painter who was important to the Northern Renaissance, frequently depicted his subjects amidst corresponding carpets and brass objects, including those resembling Ottoman and Mamluk examples that are housed in the Met's collection, so the Met Museum in New York. So today, it's not uncommon for art historians and museums, including the Met, to obscenely refer to some Anatolian loom works as Holbein carpets, that such works would be classified in scholarship according to the European artists who utilized them as still life details, does not even summarize the extent of this offense. There are other instances in which masterpieces of Islamic art are referred to not by their evident style or the artist who created them, but in the reference to the prominent European collector who owned them. So, like, if you can find your Maimana Farhat in your discipline or field, that's priceless, because that, for me, encapsulated exactly the absence of the artist, the absence of the detail, the absence of what I was looking for. And this is the reason why. And so for me, it's like this challenge has grown even bigger, and it's a bigger problem than first anticipated. But I think I have enough like rage in me about this, you know, that it will sustain me to the end. So if you're starting a PhD, or you're in one, or you've just completed one, you might have this conversation with your supervisor at some point, and they will ask you, why are you doing what you are doing? And they'll want to ask you about, like, whether this is the love of something, you know, you're passionate about it, or like there's a sense of injustice. And I said to my supervisor, am I allowed to swear, Cheryl?
Yeah, I think so.
I said to him, I'm fucking angry. And he said, good. That will sustain you. So, you know, like it's finding, you know, like this absence and this knowing, this niggling feeling that was driving me to create, you know, the exhibitions and to create the communities of artists and the museum and all these other sort of aspects of my work, is really driven by this. And, you know, in terms of my work in academia, so I teach and I lecture in Masters of Art Curatorship at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also a lecturer at RMIT University. And I mean, these courses pretty much, if you're going to be working in the arts industry in some capacity, these are the courses that you take. And, you know, being in that position, you know, as you're talking about, Yvonne, you know, being in that position, that privilege to teach, is really important part of the work that I do. And, you know, I take that opportunity to introduce students to a different way of thinking and a different way of seeing. And I openly say I corrupt my students. Like I absolutely, you know, want them to feel the responsibility and the burden of what they are doing. And, you know, that they have the responsibility to listen and they have the responsibility to make the structural changes. And, you know, like I bring in all these conversations into the classroom. The guest lecturers that you know, I invite to speak to the students are all women of colour. They are, you know, usually we have, you know, like set content, as you know, Yvonne, that you have to kind of, that's part of the course. But there's a little bit of wiggle room in the way you teach that content and the readings that you can give your students and the, you know, guest lecturers that you can bring in, and all these sort of, you know, the type of content is really important, and the students can learn through, you know, curators and artists that they wouldn't normally be really given to study. So I really sort of take advantage of that, and I really pour my heart into what I teach my students, because I see them as, you know, they're the next generation of curators and art directors, and, you know, they're going to be making decisions about what goes into collections, how that's exhibited. And, you know, like it's a fact that the general public kind of believe everything they see in a museum, that it's truth. You know, they believe that the history that's presented is truth. And so we unpack all of those ideas, you know, throughout the semester. And I hope that I've, you know, created like a little army of, you know, future arts workers that are going to champion, you know, equity and inclusion. And, you know, that, you know, I often get this question from my students like, well, what do I do? How do I know? And it's like, you need to listen. And you need to be prepared to do the hard yards. You need to be prepared to give up some things. You need to be prepared to be uncomfortable, because, you know, changing this system it will come at a cost. It's not for free. And you've got to be prepared. And so my kind of joke to, you know, as a few colleagues and friends is, I'll keep doing this until they sack me, until they're onto me and they sack me. So, you know, it's, yeah, a big part of what I love to do is also teaching. So there's the research side of it, but you often find that it's only your very small group of, you know, experts that might be, you know, that are in your field of research, and you're kind of having these closed conversations. And you know, this, you know, talk this evening or morning for you guys is you know, like about No More Ivory Towers. And essentially in academia, you are in an ivory tower and these conversations just reverberate round and round in circles. And like, I feel like teaching and going out into the field, so to speak, and curating the exhibitions and being on the ground and doing, you know, the community engagement projects and all of those things is where you get to actually practice, you know, what you've been researching. And like maybe perhaps for you, Yvonne, like publishing, you know, like, so you're teaching in this and then you're publishing, and that's where it, you know, kind of meets the, you know, the general public, and this is where students can also engage in what you're doing. So, you know, there's all these sort of layers and responsibilities that come with that, but it's, you know, it's I think an exciting space to be in. It's hard work. You're hating yourself when you're marking, like, you know, you're up to paper 100 and 4,000 word essays, and you're kind of all crumpled up like an exoskeleton, like a spider that's been sprayed. And, you know, but it's worth it in the end. And the, you know, well, I have the hope that I have somehow planted a little seed or given somebody an opportunity to think in a different way and to learn in a different way and to set them on that path. So, but it all comes back to, you know, what you were talking about earlier. It's you doing this, right? So you need to be clear about what you're doing, like your drive, and kind of, you know, making your own way. And you'll find that things just start happening around you, and it builds momentum, and that people come along with you. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they want to stop you and they want to block you. But, you know, you keep going, forging ahead. Oh, we've got time check, 15 minutes left.
But thank you.
That was probably 15 minutes ago.
Well, no, but thank you both for giving us two radically different views of what it's like to get into and why you get into academia and sort of what you do when you get there. Before I'm going to go pretty quickly to the audience to see if they've got questions, but just a little bit of just to recap a little bit of what you said. Yvonne was talking about, I think my favorite quote from you is, there's something about getting what I want that brings me joy. Who cannot join into that? And it seemed for you, it was a fight to find a path to doing what you want and still make a living. And I loved, I look at my life as if I were the main character in one of my own stories, and look at my life like a story so that I can plot it and keep your motivation. And that doing the PhD at Lancaster was seeking and finding and creating experiences that you were led from early on by other Black famous women writers. Writing soothes my soul, and that writing and books are a route to joy. I love joy, that you kept using the word joy, and that your role at Sheffield Hallam is to create experiences for others like those you want to have, creating opportunities, and for people to feel safe and be seen and be heard, that's part of what your mission is. For Noor, what was striking, I think, was couldn't see any of your culture anywhere around you, not in schools, museums, anywhere, sort of that cultural erasure. And that when you moved to Australia, it sounds like it was even worse, that there was nothing that reflected heritage outside the Anglosphere, which is a new word for me. But your solution to that was that because you couldn't find it, couldn't see it, so you made it. You know, you created what you wanted to see, even though there was no supervisor to help you, no collections of Muslim art. You founded the Muslim Museum of Australia, and that was 10 years in the making. I think that a common theme between you and Yvonne is that you need to see it to know that you can do it. And so Noor is creating that. You're the one who's creating what's being seen. And Yvonne, you saw, you know, in other Black writers, and then again, you're creating that experience and creating all of that for other people. I'm just going to check, do we have any questions coming in yet from the audience?
Excuse me for a moment. I've got to let my cat out.
Oh, okay. So Noura's leaving for just a second. I don't see any questions yet. I think that's partially, even though there's lots about how inspiring everything that you said was. I noticed, Yvonne, that you started off your talk by talking about that you were remembering your childhood, though, and giving us the story of your childhood to explain sort of where you are now, the way that your character does in Remembered, which is the title of your book. Oh, I've got a question. Yvonne's mom had the feeling of waiting for someone to die to get in. Is that true also of universities? Is a room made for Black academics, or do you have to wait for someone to die? I guess that's a question for both of you.
I think my answer would be, I would hope it's not true in academia. For me, for this role at Hallam, let's see. So I applied, I was a grade 7 when I started at Hallam, and then very quickly, I guess there was an opening. So my department needed a business and enterprise lead because it was a university priority, and I applied for that one because I had a lot of the experiences of creating events, creating a business, engaging with the public, engaging with community, and taking ideas from ideas into objects. And so that fit quite nicely. So now I'm a grade 9, so I'm a principal lecturer. And so for that one, I didn't have to wait for a colleague to, pass on. I think what I would have done if I know I want to be a professor. One, because I just like the way that sounds, Professor Yvonne Battle-Felton, but also the path to professorship is a bit easier in the US. Like I would have a better chance of being a professor back home than I would here based on the data. And so what I am willing to do though is to go somewhere that's more receptive to give me what I want. That shouldn't have to be the case. People shouldn't have to be, shouldn't have to do that. If people are from, like if someone's British and they're Black British and they're going, I want to be a professor, that should 100% be a possibility right where you are without you having to move, to a different country to do that. And so while you don't have to wait for someone to die, I think sometimes it is about creating those experiences. So it might not be a professorship within one university, it might mean going to another university, but it might also mean looking at what do I need to get from that professorship and where else can I get that? How can I create that? And yeah, so there's so much work that needs to be done. And ideally, though, you don't have to wait for someone to die to do it.
Okay, thank you. I like the idea of you're willing to go where you need to go to get what you want. I think getting what you want is the theme of everything that you said. And I still love, I feel joy when I get what I want. I think I can go with that. Noor, what about you? Do you want to address that question? Do you feel like someone has to die to get in?
Oh, definitely at Melbourne Uni. Like tenured positions are far and few between, and literally someone has to retire and move out of their office for a position to open up. They do hire a lot of academics casually and people to teach, and that's a position I'm in. I'm not tenured as an academic, so my contract ends every semester and I have to reapply for my own job each semester, and it goes on and on and on like that. So yeah, like in Melbourne, in Australia, for sure you have to wait for people to retire and move on, and it's a very long, slow, protracted process to move up the ranks in academia. In saying that, yeah, I think, especially in sort of the Ivy League colleges here in Australia, there's, I think they like to keep their traditions and they like to keep things safe. So I think it would be probably difficult to break into that. You would have to, I'm not going to give academic advice about what you'd have to do, actually, I won't. But yeah, it is difficult. I mean, it's not impossible, but yeah, it's slow here. It's very, very slow in terms of the turnover and yeah, tenured positions, even sort of longer positions, you know, like, you know, entering as a level B lecturer with a little bit of research time allocated, you know, that would be fixed for 3 years. That would be like a fixed term. So yeah, it is a bit slower and harder to be tenured in Australia, definitely. And of course, you know, there are people graduating and students doing PhDs, and we sort of sat down at the beginning of our PhD and told, well, if you're doing a PhD because you think you're going to stay on and have a job in academia, don't go there. Like, don't have that in mind. And they actually sort of have industry people coming in to talk about how you can take your PhD qualifications and re-enter the workforce and not necessarily focus on being an academic. And, you know, there are incredible, I've seen like many incredible, you know, early career researchers give up. They try and try and try and try. And they try to, you know, you're basically trying to fund your own positions with postdoctoral fellowships, and you're competing. And oftentimes you will get it, like if you get a postdoctoral fellowship as an early career researcher, you're not promised a job at the end of that at the university. So it's messy business here, and it's pretty brutal. I'm not sure if I would stay in academia. I'm kind of like okay about going back to industry, because my kind of, as an art historian and curator, I love art and artists, and of course I want to be, you know, still curating and working with artists. But part of me also feels that responsibility to be documenting and creating the you know, the research and providing those resources for other people to be able to you know, draw on. So, you know, I'm trying to build a field here essentially that kind of doesn't exist. So I don't know how that will how it will go. I'm okay with kind of it not going anywhere, just because I don't think I want to be that person that has to fight other people for positions, which is what essentially happens here. So yeah, and that's not me giving up. That's me kind of being okay with it, because as I said, like the love of being in industry and working with artists and creating exhibitions and being in that space and working in museums and galleries is kind of, it's on par. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. We might just go a couple of minutes over, because now we've got a lot of questions. Another question, I see such incredible bravery with what you have and are doing. Where do you draw your courage from, and how can that be repeated? Yvonne, if maybe you'd like to answer that first, and I just have to answer my door.
Sure. I'm going to, it's such a great question. And for me, I think the courage, so part of it, I think I draw from the past, and part of it is drawn from my present and future. The part I draw from the past is my grandmother is, again, she's just one of those people who she got things done in a way that didn't hurt other people. And I want to be that sort of person. So she created dreams and she followed her dreams, and there weren't people that she hurt to get where she wanted to be. For me, it's so admirable. I can go to her old community in Atlantic City and talk about my grandmother, and there are people who still love and admire her and remember her fondly. And I always think that's such an incredible legacy. And there are people who remember their family, like spending time at one of her houses and feeling so welcome, and I want that. And then also I draw, I think, incredible courage from, really, I'm a mom, and I guess I mom differently than maybe my mom was able to. And so for me, a lot of the decisions that I do, it's inspired by the legacy I want to leave behind. So I want my kids to be able to know that there are no limits. There's no boundaries to their expectations or to their experiences, to their dreams. And I'm not going to put a label on how far they can go. I also don't want them to accept a label from someone else. And so I think I get that courage from creating the world that I want and that I want to be a part of by knowing that I want my kids to feel that and I want them to follow that and pursue that. And like Cheryl was pointing out too, probably it comes from me liking to get what I want. And so that gives you an incredible amount of courage when if you know that no one's going to be able to give you what you want, and they can't give it to you if you don't know what it is, they can't give it to you if you don't articulate it. No one can read my mind for me. And so that you just do it. Like you just like, I know that there are so many ways or reasons not to do some of the things that I want to do. There's so many other people maybe willing to tell me no, not yet, not here, or whatever, and I refuse to be one of those. So I tell myself, and I give myself an abundance of yeses, and I follow it in the pursuit of creating and being joy.
Thank you. And you?
Yeah, you know, I love this idea of abundance of yeses, and it reminds me of, you know, because I'm a mum as well. I've got 5 children, and you can get very much sort of taken away by being a mum. And, you know, really what you were talking about earlier resonated with me as well. Like, you realize that they're okay. They can do things for themselves. You know, you can let go and pursue what you want to do. And that in itself is also, I guess, mumming, as you say, because you're creating opportunities and experiences and possibilities for your kids by pursuing what you want to pursue. And, you know, your kids, they have a mum who's, you know, an author and who's a doctor and, you know, like all these amazing things. So, you know, that idea of yes. And, you know, it was my husband who said to me, because I'd have these sort of you know, opportunities come up to travel to go curate somewhere, and I'd always be overthinking and like, I can't leave the kids for that many days, you know, like, because you just think you're responsible for everything. And he said to me, just say yes and we'll work it out later. So that was his attitude, and I always remembered that, you know, just say yes and work out the details later, because you'll think yourself out of doing things, because there's always too many reasons why you shouldn't, or why it wouldn't be possible, or why it would be difficult. So you just say yes and you work it out and you go do it. So yeah, I mean, I would say saying yes to yourself is really important, and giving yourself that permission and just kind of working it out and, you know, taking that challenge on. And, you know, I think, yeah, if you're passionate about something or you're driven, or in my case, something's annoying you, and you're just like, right, righto, this needs to be fixed. You know, find what drives you, and you'll, like, it has to be personal. Like, I mean, it has to be, I mean, not that it has to be a personal reason, it could be in service of somebody else, in service of your community, in service of, but I mean, like, personal as in, it's how you feel when you're alone with yourself. It's, you have that same drive, or you have that same, it's completely 100%. Whether there were 100 people around you, one person listening to you, 1,000 people, it doesn't matter, it's in you. So I would say it needs to, like, come essentially from you, and that will sustain you, you know. And you know, even if you can't find people around you exactly doing what you're doing, or, like, you know, you'll find people that will support what you're doing. They don't have to understand everything about what you're doing, especially if you're trying something new, or you're, you know, making your own way. You don't have to be able to explain everything, or have people around you that exactly know what you're doing. That helps, and that's, you know, that's a great thing. But I think it's enough if you've just got resources and kind of something around you that will support you.
Well,
If anything. Yeah.
thank you both. We're actually at the, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Noor, but we're actually, we're a little bit beyond our time. But I want to at least read these last two questions because they're good questions. And maybe if you can give really quick answers, because our next event, which is in conversation with Jennifer Makumbi, is going to be at 11:45. So we're going to have to disappear quite soon. How are you received by colleagues in both terms of your subject and your ethnicity? Do you feel valued? And then the other question is, thank you for the amazing lectures. My question is to both of you. When we find a gap of or lack of representation and talk about it, it is nullified by many academicians as essentialism, or it is denied by the already existing big theories, which may completely go against lived experience. So how can we confront this as students from marginalized communities? I love to hear how you manage to deal with such things inside academia. Now, that's much too big a question to answer in 3 minutes, but if you could give a really short sort of beginning of an answer to that. Yvonne?
Sure. So to the first one about how at least how I'm received by colleagues in terms of subject and ethnicity, I would feel I think right now the biggest challenge seems to be by subject. And I think part of that is because of the culture in the UK seems to be currently that they don't value the subject of creative writing. It often seems like you can be within an institution and other people in this instance, other people in the same institution don't realize that they teach your subject either. And so that seems to be one of the challenges right now, is holding on to creative writing. I think all of humanities is facing that right now. And so that seems to be the biggest struggle. As far as my ethnicity, I think it's hard for me to say because I've always been a Black woman. I feel like it's hard to say that experience of like, is this because I'm a Black woman? And the way I always think about it is that I've always been a Black woman, except when I was younger and I had the privilege of being a Black little girl. But here, I'm also an American. And I feel like that's the thing I feel most often, is that there are some, sorry, this is to go, there are some assumptions made about because I'm American. And some of those might seem to be how quick I am to action, how I might have a gun, or which actually somebody had mentioned that. Or how I mark might be more generous because I'm American. So I think those are the things that I've heard. And the other question, I think is a really good question. I'm not sure what I would say in 60 seconds. But I would say that if you're a student and you feel that you need to confront if someone is questioning your lived experience, I feel like I'm always a big fan of going a step above and a step over someone, so that when I know I had a situation where someone said that they weren't offended by something that I, as a Black American woman, found offensive. And because they didn't have the privilege of being a Black American woman, I didn't think them telling me what was offensive to me was, that wasn't how it was going to be. So I did email the VC and we had a great conversation and we met in person. And I felt like that's how change happens. So sometimes people who you think are, are the ones, the front line, they're not ready to change or they don't see it. And you just have to go a step above, but keep fighting that and keep bringing it up, keep talking about it, keep opening conversations for it.
Thank you. And Noor, you've got 60 seconds or less as well.
Okay.
Thank you for unpacking that, complexity so quickly.
And I'll just sort of quickly add to what Yvonne was saying. So I'll reverse and I'll answer the last question first. It's called CC and BCC. So, copy in superiors and don't be afraid. You're not the one in the wrong. And, you can sort of, you need to lean into your truth. And I feel like we're living through a moment where that's becoming more possible. And, like you will be believed. And the other question was, I'll just be very quick. So how are you received by colleagues and both of your, right. So my research subject matter is pretty new in Australia. So contemporary Islamic arts, a new subject area. In terms of my teaching, that's an old, like, it's a very well-established course. I also guest lecture in other subjects, and I have shown up for a lecture and gone to sort of move over to the lectern to plug in my USB, and I've been asked by students in the class if I'm lost. So, you know, like, how am I received? I feel like, and I've also been asked for the mail when I've been standing by a lift near the mail room. But, you know, aside from a few kind of incidences like that, and asked if I work at the Immigration Museum as well. I must work at the Immigration Museum, right? So, you know, like, you do kind of get those hints of like stereotyping and racism, but it's kind of like, it doesn't affect me. I find it as a kind of, you know, like, it shows who they are, not who I am. So yeah, like, I do sort of experience some kind of overt commentary and some overt racism, but it's like, I'm not, you know, I'm powering on, like, I'm doing what I need to do, and yeah, pretty sort of focused. And, you know, just sort of lack of representation and marginalized voices, you know, you just sort of keep working through what you want to work through, and, you know, you can introduce new ideas and new thoughts and sort of back yourself. That's all I can say. You just have to back yourself, and, you know, find the people around you that are listening and will back you too.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Yvonne Battle-Felton. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to hear a bit from her brilliant, much nominated, wonderful book, Remembered. Oh. I have to say that, you know, you got to big up your folks. And thank you, Shkembi, for joining us last thing at night from Australia. And thank you both for giving us such, you know, full, generous, you know, glimpses into how you got into academia and what it's like for you there. For those of you who've joined us this morning or this evening, a poll just came up. That poll is to help us get more money from the Arts Council. So please fill out the poll. And I wish, you know, I just want to give a big thank you again to our lovely two panelists who've given me a lot to think about in terms of how to frame the rest of the conference. If you want to come back in about 15 minutes, we have In Conversation with Jennifer Makumbi, who's just won the Jollick Prize that Yvonne was also nominated for. And I don't know what else to say except thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of our audience as well. And to our wonderful team whose rest time I have just broken into. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.